The day they tried to take my home, the sun was almost too calm for what was about to unfold. It was one of those unnervingly perfect mornings, birds chirping, a soft wind gliding across the lake, and a house that had finally begun to feel like mine. But as I stood on my porch, coffee still warm in my hands, I watched a convoy of dark SUVs snake down the narrow road leading to my property. The air shifted then, not in temperature, but in something deeper. It was that quiet, gut-deep signal that something irreversible had just begun. The first to arrive wasn't the police. It was them. The HOA board members, dressed like they were heading to a courtroom, not a neighbor's home. They stepped out slowly, as if they owned the ground beneath my porch. And behind them came the flashing red and blue lights, an entire wall of authority meant to make me look small, guilty, powerless. My name wasn't just on some letter anymore. This was personal. They were here to take everything, but what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this house had a story far older and deeper than any petty HOA bylaw, and they had just walked into a war they didn't fully understand. For months they had stalked me with letters, fines, and warnings for things I never agreed to, things they had no real claim over. But now they were ready to drag this conflict into the light. And I was ready too. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, whispering, speculating. They had seen HOA board members flex their power before, but nothing like this. This time, they weren't just enforcing their rules. They were trying to rewrite history, to erase something that wasn't theirs to touch. I took one last slow breath, feeling the weight of everything coming to a boil. Every step they took closer to my gate felt like a countdown. And as they raised their papers, declaring this house wasn't really mine, one single thought burned hotter than the morning sun. How far would they go to take what's mine? And how far would I go to stop them? When I first moved into the lakefront community of Ridgewood Shores, I thought I had found peace. After years of city noise, long commutes, and the constant hum of life that never stopped to breathe, this place felt like stepping into a forgotten dream. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. The water reflected the sky like a living mirror, and the old mansion that sat quietly at the end of the gravel road called to me the moment I saw it. The locals called it Hollow Lake House, a name whispered with both nostalgia and unease. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot beneath ivy and silence. But to me it was perfect, a project worth rebuilding, a home worth saving. The property stood slightly apart from the rest of the neighborhood, close enough to be part of Ridgewood Shores, but far enough that it felt like its own world. On calm mornings I could hear the faint hum of life from the other houses, sprinklers turning on, dogs barking, children laughing before school. But my land was different, quiet, untouched, and somehow freer. Maybe that's why I fell in love with it. The mansion's wooden beams were worn but strong. The cracked porch creaked underfoot like it was sighing with relief to finally have company again. For the first few weeks, my days settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. Mornings began with coffee by the lake, as the mist rolled off the surface like slow-moving smoke. I'd spend the afternoon sanding down old doors, fixing broken shutters, and repainting the gate that guarded the property. At night, I'd sit by the window with a small lamp, studying the old house plans I'd found tucked inside a drawer in the foyer. Yellowed, hand-drawn maps of a place once called the Pines Estate. Each line told a story of what this home used to be, a place of laughter, gatherings, and maybe even love. I wanted to bring that back. The neighbors were polite at first, friendly in that distant suburban way. A wave here, a nod there. Some would stop during their evening walks and comment on the progress I was making. "It's nice to see someone finally giving that place life again," one man said as he passed with his dog. His smile was kind, but there was something restrained behind it. A hesitation, like he wasn't sure if he was happy or wary that I had come back. Then there were the others, the watchers. They'd slow their cars when driving by, studying my every move with that mix of curiosity and judgment that only small communities seem to master. I remember one woman in particular, thin, blonde, always wearing perfectly pressed pastel sweaters, even on warm afternoons. She'd pass by in her white SUV, eyes locked on my gate, lips tight. I'd wave once or twice, but she never waved back. I didn't know it then, but that woman would later make my life a living hell. Her name, as I would come to learn, was Karen Whitfield. She was the president of the Ridgewood Shores Homeowners Association, the unofficial queen of the neighborhood, or at least that's what she believed. Her husband had left years ago, but she carried herself like a woman still married to authority. Every inch of her screamed control, from her manicured nails to her spotless SUV that carried the HOA emblem like a badge of power. The HOA itself wasn't much when I first arrived. I'd heard of it, of course. Every neighborhood seemed to have one these days. Groups meant to maintain community standards, which usually meant dictating the color of your mailbox or how tall your grass could grow. I didn't think much of it. I wasn't looking for trouble. All I wanted was a quiet place to rebuild and live in peace. But peace, I learned, was the one thing Ridgewood Shores didn't allow. It started small, subtle, a letter left on my gate one morning, tucked into a clear plastic sleeve. Welcome to the Ridgewood Shores community. Please contact the HOA for your registration packet. The letter was polite, printed in neat serif font, and signed by Ridgewood Shores Board of Directors. I assumed it was routine and made a mental note to call them later that week. But by the time I did, they already seemed impatient. The voice on the phone was sharp, clipped, efficient. Mr. Carter, we've noticed you've made several exterior changes to your property without HOA approval. I blinked. You mean repainting the fence? Yes, and trimming the hedges along the lake path. You'll need to submit a landscaping modification form before any additional changes. I paused, trying to hold back a laugh. The hedges were dead. I removed them so I could see the water. A long silence followed. Then the woman spoke again, slower this time, as if talking to a stubborn child. Ridgewood Shores follows strict community aesthetics. You'll be receiving a fine notice shortly, a fine. For cutting dead hedges, that was my first real taste of the HOA. It wasn't about rules, it was about control. Still, I paid the fine, thinking that would be the end of it. But the following week, another letter arrived. This time, it complained about the color of my new gate. The dark wood tone does not match the approved community palette. I stared at the letter for a long time, disbelief turning to irritation. The mansion was nearly half a mile from the nearest house. Who cared what color my gate was? I soon discovered the answer. Karen cared. A few days later, I saw her SUV parked near the end of my drive. She wasn't alone. 2 other board members stood beside her, clipboards in hand. They looked like a team of auditors inspecting a crime scene. I approached, still polite, still trying to believe this was some kind of misunderstanding. "Can I help you folks?" I asked. Karen gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just conducting a community standards check, Mr. Carter. We've received reports of unapproved renovations." Reports. That word stuck in my head. Someone had been watching me closely enough to file a report. I gestured toward the mansion. "I'm restoring it, not changing it. It's the same structure that's been here for decades." Her gaze traveled over the house, the fresh paint on the gate, the newly mowed grass. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but restoration still requires oversight." Her tone was calm, almost friendly, but there was steel beneath it. I could feel the judgment, the authority she believed she held. One of the men with her scribbled notes on his clipboard, pretending not to notice the tension thickening in the air. "We'll be in touch," she said, and with that, she turned and walked back to her SUV. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked in the wind, and every sound felt heavier somehow. I told myself I was overreacting, but a part of me knew this wasn't normal. People who cared about community standards didn't show up with clipboards and threats. They showed up with casseroles and conversation. This felt different, predatory. The next morning, another envelope hung from my gate. It wasn't typed this time. It was handwritten in neat cursive, compliance reminder. Failure to adhere to HOA guidelines may result in escalation. There was no signature. No contact information, just that single word at the end. Escalation. I remember standing there by the gate, the lake stretching calm and silent behind me. and realizing that something had shifted. The dream I had built here was starting to crack piece by piece. Still, I tried to ignore it. I poured myself into restoring the house, replacing broken shutters, replanting the garden, even rebuilding the dock that jutted into the lake. Every nail I hammered was a small rebellion, a reminder that this was my land, my home. But it seemed like every improvement brought another letter, another complaint. It wasn't long before I learned that Karen's influence stretched far beyond those letters. She had the neighbors in her grip, some out of loyalty, others out of fear. At the weekly community gatherings, she'd stand at the head of the room, doling out praise or scorn like a queen, ruling over her subjects. The other board members followed her lead, Mark, the timid treasurer who never met her gaze, Linda, the vice president, who echoed every one of her opinions, and Todd, the enforcer, a former security guard who took far too much pride in his role as compliance officer. Together, they ruled Ridgewood Shores not through law, but through intimidation. Whenever I passed by the community center, I could feel their eyes on me, the outsider who had dared to move into the forgotten mansion. Whispers followed me. "He's not registered with the HOA yet. Did you see the color of his gate? Probably thinks he's above the rules." It didn't matter that I was polite, that I waved, that I tried to be part of this place. I was already the enemy. The strangest part was how coordinated it all felt. Like someone was deliberately pushing me, testing how far I would bend before I broke. There were nights when I'd find footprints by the fence or my mailbox left open with no mail inside. Once I caught Todd parked near the lake at midnight, claiming he was checking on noise complaints. There had been no noise. There had been no complaints. Only them, circling, tightening, waiting, and yet, in the middle of it all, I held on to a quiet sense of defiance, because every time I looked at the lake, I remembered why I came here, to build something honest, to reclaim a piece of life the world had taken. I didn't know it then, but that quiet defiance, that belief that truth would protect me, was about to be tested in ways I couldn't have imagined. The letters were just the beginning. The real war hadn't started yet, and when it did, they wouldn't just come after my home, they'd come after me. It started with a notice, plain, official, and cold. A piece of paper slipped under the front door, folded neatly but carrying an invisible weight. Violation, unauthorized fence paint color, just 7 words, and a fine amount stamped at the bottom. To any outsider, it might have seemed trivial, even laughable. But to Emily Carter, it marked the beginning of something she could not yet comprehend. A slow unraveling of peace, a test of will that would shake every part of her calm, suburban life. The neighborhood of Oak Ridge Hills had always projected the illusion of perfection. Every lawn trimmed to precision, mailboxes matching in design, driveways spotless. On the surface, it was an image straight out of a real estate brochure, pristine, organized, and safe. But behind that manicured order was something darker, a hunger for control disguised as community management. The HOA board called it preserving property values. Emily would soon learn it was about something else entirely: dominance. After the first notice, she repainted the fence to match the approved color. Beige, lifeless, dull, identical to every other fence on the block. She assumed that would be the end of it. But just 3 days later, another envelope appeared. Violation, trash cans visible from street. The fine was larger this time. She could almost hear their condescending tone in the formal wording, as if she were a misbehaving child being corrected by self-appointed guardians of order. Her next-door neighbor, Harold Mills, was on the HOA board. He liked to smile with his lips, never his eyes. He had once mentioned casually that he'd noticed her trash cans left out a bit too long after collection day. At the time, it had felt like small talk. Now it felt like surveillance. Emily tried to ignore it at first. She paid the fine, hid her trash cans, and kept her head down. But the letters kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. Grass exceeding height regulation, unauthorized mailbox ornament, unapproved lighting fixture. She spent her weekends fixing trivial details that no one else would ever notice. Yet somehow, The HOA always did. It wasn't long before she started noticing a pattern. The violations always came after small disagreements. Once she questioned the HOA president, Linda Pierce, during a community meeting. She'd merely asked why the board had increased monthly fees again. Linda's polite smile faltered for just a moment before returning to its usual mask. The next morning, another notice appeared, this time claiming her garden plants obstructed visibility from the street. Coincidence? She wanted to believe so. But deep down, she knew she had crossed an invisible line. In Oak Ridge Hills, questioning authority wasn't just discouraged, it was punished. As the weeks turned into months, Emily began to sense the shift in her surroundings. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Conversations at the mailbox ended abruptly when she approached. She could feel eyes following her every time she stepped outside, watching, judging, reporting. The HOA didn't need security cameras. It had an army of compliant residents. Too afraid to defy the board, the tension deepened. When she received a final warning letter, threatening legal action if she didn't comply with the HOA's ever-changing demands. This time, it wasn't about paint or plants. It was about her dog. They claimed his barking violated noise regulations. But her dog, Cooper, was quiet, gentle, and rarely made a sound. It was ridiculous. Still, the letter demanded she rectify the issue immediately. That night, as she stood on her porch, reading the letter under the dim light, she saw Harold watching from his yard. His face was unreadable, but his smirk told her everything she needed to know. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. The stress began to take its toll. Sleep became elusive, meals forgotten. She started keeping every letter, every notice, in a box under her desk, evidence of something she couldn't yet define, but knew was wrong. Her friends told her to move, to walk away, but it wasn't that simple. This was her home, the place she'd saved for, dreamed about, and built piece by piece. She wasn't going to let a group of petty bureaucrats bully her out of it. The HOA meetings grew more hostile. When she raised her voice to defend herself, Linda would interrupt her with a calm, practiced tone. "Mrs. Carter, please maintain decorum. The board has rules for a reason." The other members would nod in silent agreement, pretending to listen while already writing their next citation. It became a ritual, Emily speaking truth and them erasing it with paperwork. Then came the landscaping dispute. Emily had hired a local gardener to redesign her small front yard, hoping to make it feel more personal. Colorful flowers, a small stone pathway, and a bird bath. It wasn't extravagant, just alive. Within a week, she received a violation stating her yard did not meet community aesthetic standards. The fine was triple the usual amount. She appealed it, attended the next board meeting, and presented photos showing her yard was cleaner and more vibrant than most. Linda's response was chillingly simple. The board's decision is final. That was when Emily realized the game had changed. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules. They were weaponizing them. Each day brought new provocations. An anonymous complaint about her guests parking too long in her driveway. A letter demanding she remove unauthorized objects, referring to her children's bicycles. The neighborhood that once felt safe now felt like a stage. Every movement observed, every action judged. Emily decided she wouldn't play by their rules anymore. She began documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, conversations, even the expressions on the board members' faces. Her frustration hardened into resolve. They wanted obedience. She would give them resistance instead. The breaking point came when she received notice of a mandatory property inspection. The board claimed it was routine, but she knew better. When she refused to allow them onto her property without a warrant, they fined her heavily and threatened legal action. That night, as she sat by her window, she watched a car slow down in front of her house. The headlights lingered for a moment before disappearing into the dark. It wasn't paranoia anymore. They were watching. She decided to fight back the only way she could by exposing them. She reached out to other homeowners, quietly at first, asking if they'd experienced similar harassment. To her surprise, several admitted they had: small injustices, dismissed appeals, unexplained fines, but none had dared to speak up publicly. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was absolute, fueled by fear and conformity. Emily started compiling their stories, connecting the dots, uncovering patterns of favoritism and corruption. Some board members' relatives had special exemptions. Others had contracts with local service providers, landscapers, painters, even towing companies, profiting directly from HOA enforcement. It wasn't just petty power. It was organized exploitation. When Emily presented her findings at the next community meeting, the room went silent. She laid out documents, emails, and testimony from multiple residents. Linda's composure cracked for the first time. "These are baseless accusations," she said, voice trembling slightly. But the damage was done. The room buzzed with murmurs, suspicion, realization, anger. After that night, the retaliation escalated. Her mailbox was vandalized. Anonymous letters appeared on her doorstep with threats. One morning she found a dead plant, the same type she had planted in her yard, left on her porch, roots torn out, dirt scattered. It wasn't just intimidation. It was a message: stop or we'll bury you. But Emily didn't stop. She went to the county records office, requested financial disclosures, and found irregularities, missing funds, inflated maintenance costs, payments to non-existent vendors. She knew she was sitting on something explosive. Every move she made seemed to push the board closer to panic. Harold confronted her one afternoon, his smile gone. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said quietly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Emily met his gaze and replied, "No, Harold. You are." By then, the neighborhood had started to change. People whispered more openly, questioning the board's actions. A few even thanked Emily in hushed tones. The once perfect illusion of Oak Ridge Hills was cracking. The HOA's control was slipping, and they could feel it. Then came the lawsuit. The HOA filed a claim against Emily for defamation and disruption of community order. It was their boldest move yet, an attempt to silence her completely. But they underestimated her resolve. She countered with her own legal complaint, backed by evidence and testimonies from other residents. What began as petty notices about fences and trash cans had grown into a full-scale war, not just for one home, but for the soul of the neighborhood. And as the courtroom date drew near, the lines between right and wrong blurred, replaced by something far more human: fear, pride, and the desperate need to be heard. The HOA had turned her life into a battlefield. But Emily wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, bullied, and fined into submission. She was fighting for freedom in a place that pretended to offer it. And, though the outcome was still uncertain, one thing was clear: Oak Ridge Hills would never be the same again. The courtroom felt colder than it should have. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing every face in a pale, unforgiving glow. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart pounding with a rhythm that no calm breath could slow. In front of her, the long oak bench where the judge would sit loomed like an altar, the place where truth would finally clash with power. The HOA's representatives sat across from her, 3 board members in their formal suits and brittle smiles, led by Linda Pierce herself. It had all come down to this moment: months of fines, threats, and fear, now condensed into the quiet hum of anticipation before a storm. The attorney beside Emily whispered, "Stay calm. We have them cornered," but calm was impossible. She wasn't here just for herself anymore. She was here for everyone who had been bullied, silenced, or humiliated under the HOA's so-called authority. This wasn't about trash cans or fences or noise violations. It was about control and the people who'd abused it for too long. As the judge entered, everyone rose. Emily could feel every eye on her. Even the residents of Oak Ridge Hills, many of them once silent bystanders, had shown up to witness what would become the defining moment of their community. Some looked guilty, others looked hopeful. A few still seemed afraid. But the air was different now, heavier, electric, charged with the weight of long-suppressed truth, ready to break free. Linda began her testimony first. Her tone was polished, confident, the voice of someone used to getting their way. "Our only goal," she said sweetly, "has always been to maintain order and fairness within Oak Ridge Hills." Mrs. Carter repeatedly violated the agreed-upon standards, ignored community regulations, and disrupted meetings. "We regret that it came to this, but her behavior left us no choice." Emily's attorney didn't interrupt. He simply let her words hang there, deliberate and rehearsed. Then he stood. "Mrs. Carter, tell the court what really happened." Emily rose slowly, her palms trembling, but her gaze steady. As she began to speak, her voice cracked at first, but it soon found strength. She described the first letter, the first fine, the slow suffocation of peace by bureaucracy. She spoke of the endless harassment, the manipulation, the way neighbors were turned into informants. Her words painted pictures of quiet evenings interrupted by knocks on the door, of her children asking why everyone seemed to hate them, of watching the life she built crumble under the weight of paper and pettiness. When she reached the part about the vandalism, the dead plant left on her porch, her voice wavered, not from fear, but from fury. "They didn't just want compliance," she said, locking eyes with Linda. "They wanted obedience. And when I refused to bow, they tried to break me." The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens and the faint hum of the ceiling lights. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but intent. Emily's attorney then began presenting the evidence: photos, timestamps, official letters riddled with contradictions, emails that revealed favoritism, and secret contracts with local businesses. One by one, the documents landed on the table before the judge, each a nail in the coffin of the HOA's illusion of integrity. And then came the witness statements. One by one, residents of Oak Ridge Hills stood up, people who had once been too afraid to speak. A soft-spoken elderly man named Mr. Harris admitted he had been fined for unauthorized tree trimming when his wife was in the hospital. A young mother, voice shaking, revealed she was forced to pay hundreds in penalties after her child's toy was left on the lawn overnight. Every story added weight to the truth that this was not an isolated conflict, but a system of quiet oppression. Linda tried to interject, her voice growing sharper. "These are baseless exaggerations. The board acted within its legal rights." But the judge's gavel struck once, silencing her. "You'll have your turn, Mrs. Pierce," he said sternly. When it finally came, her composure began to crack. Under cross-examination, Emily's attorney produced bank statements, HOA funds funneled through maintenance accounts into businesses owned by Linda's brother-in-law. He displayed meeting transcripts showing falsified votes and unapproved spending. Linda's responses grew shorter, her confidence shrinking with every piece of evidence. Her attorney's objections became desperate. The audience could feel it, the balance shifting. Years of whispered injustice, now exposed under the unrelenting light of truth. And then came the final moment. The recording. Emily had kept it hidden, uncertain whether she would ever use it. But now it was time. She handed her phone to the attorney, who connected it to the court's speaker system. A faint click, then Linda's voice filled the room. "If we keep pushing her, she'll either move out or snap. Either way, problem solved." The silence that followed was absolute. Linda's face went white, her mouth opening, but no words coming out. The judge looked up slowly, eyes hard with disgust. "Mrs. Pierce," he said quietly, "you will remain silent for the remainder of these proceedings." The board members beside her avoided her gaze. One of them, Harold, visibly swallowed, guilt etched across his face. He knew it was over. The rest of the trial unfolded swiftly after that. The judge ordered a full audit of the HOA's finances, suspended the board's authority pending investigation, and demanded immediate cessation of all fines and penalties imposed under their administration. But it wasn't just a legal victory. It was moral vindication. As the gavel struck for the last time, Emily exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The weight on her chest lifted, replaced by a flood of emotions she couldn't name: relief, exhaustion, triumph, sorrow. Around her, the residents erupted into quiet applause. Some cried. Others hugged each other. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Hills felt united, not in fear, but in freedom. But Linda wasn't finished. As people began to file out, she stood, trembling, her voice low but venomous. "You think this changes anything? You embarrassed me, but you'll regret it." "They always do." Emily turned to face her, eyes steady. "No, Linda. The only thing I regret is not standing up sooner." Those words hung in the air, final and undeniable. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, cameras flashing. The story of one woman's fight against her HOA had spread far beyond the neighborhood. People across the county, even the state, had followed her case. As she stepped into the sunlight, she wasn't just Emily Carter, homeowner. She was a symbol of resistance, but victory came with its scars. When she returned home, the house looked different, familiar yet foreign. The same fence, the same yard, but the atmosphere had changed. For the first time, she could walk her property without the fear of being watched. She touched the fence that had started it all, that beige, lifeless fence, and smiled. Soon, she would paint it any color she wanted. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to shift. The old HOA dissolved under legal pressure. A new one was formed, run by residents who understood what community really meant. Harold resigned, disappearing quietly. Linda faced criminal charges for fraud and misconduct, but it wasn't just about punishment. It was about healing. Neighbors who once avoided Emily now approached her with gratitude and apology. Children played freely again. The fear that had once poisoned every corner of Oak Ridge Hills was gone, replaced by laughter and conversation. Still, even in victory, Emily carried the memories, the letters, the meetings, the sleepless nights. Some part of her would always remember what it felt like to live under someone else's thumb. But she had learned something vital. Silence was compliance. And when people stood together, even the most powerful could fall. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she sat on her porch with a cup of tea. The air was calm, still, peaceful. The kind of peace she once thought she'd lost forever. Her phone buzzed with a message from a stranger, another homeowner from a different state, sharing their own story of HOA abuse and thanking her for giving them courage. Emily smiled faintly. Her story was no longer just hers. It had become a spark, and yet, even now, as she looked down the street, at the houses still perfect, the lawns still trimmed, she wondered how many other neighborhoods hid the same secrets. How many other Lindas sat in meetings, quietly tightening their grip? How many other Emilys were out there, too afraid to fight back, her eyes lifted to the fading light? "Maybe," she whispered, "it's time they all did." The screen would fade to black there, but the echo of her words would linger. Because in every community, behind every perfect lawn and polished rulebook, there's a story like hers waiting to be told. One that reminds us that peace without justice is just quiet oppression. And somewhere, beyond the silence, someone else is about to stand up. The days that followed the courtroom victory felt strangely still, almost too quiet. For months, Emily had grown used to tension humming in the background of her life, like a constant electrical buzz that never went away. But now, standing on her porch beneath a soft orange dawn, she realized that silence had a new meaning. It wasn't fear anymore. It was freedom. The air felt cleaner. The birds seemed louder. Even the creak of the fence she had once resented now sounded like a familiar friend clearing its throat after a long silence. The news spread faster than anyone could have expected. Within hours, the county paper ran a headline that read, "Local HOA exposed. Homeowners fight back against fraud." Within days, regional stations were covering the story. They came with cameras, reporters, and microphones, all eager to capture the story of the woman who took on her homeowners association and won. Emily didn't want fame, but she realized the story wasn't hers to hide. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced by petty power and bureaucracy. She stood before those cameras with calm dignity. Not rehearsed, not bitter, just honest. It wasn't about breaking rules, she told one reporter softly. It was about people who thought they were the rules. We just wanted our peace back. And that peace, though fragile, had begun to grow again. The county launched a full investigation into Oak Ridge Hills' HOA finances. Boxes of records were seized. Auditors combed through years of falsified accounts and personal transfers. It turned out the board had been exploiting homeowners for years, forging fees, rerouting maintenance funds into private accounts, even fabricating votes to stay in power. The revelation hit the community like a thunderclap. At first, there was denial. Some residents, especially those who had sided with Linda, refused to believe it. They whispered that Emily had exaggerated, that she was just seeking attention. But the documents spoke louder than rumors. When the bank statements and emails became public record, even the staunchest defenders of the old HOA fell silent. Then came the reckoning. Linda Pierce was formally charged with fraud, misuse of funds, and impersonation of an officer, each count carrying its own weight. Her carefully curated image of authority shattered overnight. The same people who once feared her now crossed the street to avoid her. Her picture was splashed across every local news segment, her reputation collapsing under the truth she had tried so hard to bury, one by one. Her allies resigned. Harold, the treasurer who'd signed off on every fake invoice. Paula, who'd enforced petty rules just to stay in favor. Even the property manager who had turned a blind eye. The HOA dissolved under court order, its assets frozen pending restitution. The subdivision that had once operated under fear was suddenly free. Disoriented, but free. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Hills held a community meeting that wasn't dictated by intimidation or hidden agendas. It was held in the park under the same oak trees where children used to play before the HOA banned unauthorized gatherings. The turnout was overwhelming. Dozens of families arrived with folding chairs, homemade lemonade, and notebooks. Emily didn't intend to lead, but when people saw her, they instinctively made space for her at the front. She hesitated before speaking. "I'm not here to run anything," she began. "I'm just here to remind us that this neighborhood was never supposed to be about control. It was supposed to be about community." Applause rippled through the crowd. People nodded. Some cried. For the first time, the residents of Oak Ridge Hills looked at one another, not as adversaries, but as neighbors again. They discussed forming a new council, not an HOA with the power to punish, but a cooperative built on transparency. It would exist to serve, not to dominate. Volunteers stepped forward to help, including some who had once enforced the old regime's rules out of fear. They too wanted redemption. Meanwhile, Emily's life began to settle back into rhythm. But it wasn't the same rhythm as before. It was steadier, fuller. The house that once felt like a battlefield now felt alive again. She repainted the gate a deep forest green, the same color her husband had once loved. She rebuilt her garden, planting wildflowers instead of perfectly manicured roses, a quiet rebellion against the rigid symmetry the HOA once demanded. She started to enjoy the little things again. Morning coffee by the lake, the laughter of children next door, the sound of her wind chimes, a sound she had once silenced out of fear of another noise complaint. But freedom wasn't without its ghosts. Every now and then, she'd find traces of the past, an old notice pinned to her garage, a cracked HOA emblem lying forgotten in the grass. Each reminder stung, but it also reaffirmed what she had overcome. She had learned that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the courage to face it. A few months later, she received a letter from the county courthouse. It contained the final notice of restitution. The funds stolen from the HOA's account were being redistributed back to the homeowners. Most would receive only a few $100s, a small fraction of what had been taken. But to Emily, it wasn't about the money. It was about closure. Justice had found its way through the cracks, however slowly. Linda, on the other hand, was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with probation to follow. The local paper printed one last story about her downfall, a sharp contrast to the lavish charity galas she once hosted. Emily didn't rejoice when she read it. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone broken, even if they had earned it. But she did feel something close to relief. The system had finally worked the way it was supposed to. In time, the neighborhood changed in more ways than one. Fences that had divided neighbors came down. People started talking again, sharing tools, organizing potlucks, helping one another repair old fences and repaint porches. Even the children who had once been warned not to play too loudly now filled the streets with laughter. The fear that had once hung in the air like fog slowly evaporated. One evening, during a golden summer sunset, Emily stood at the edge of her property and watched the reflection of the sky ripple across the lake. Sheriff Daniels, who had become a good friend since the trial, stopped by for coffee. "It's strange," he said, glancing around. "Feels like a different place now," Emily smiled. "It is," he nodded, setting down his cup. "You know, you did something big here. Not just for yourself, for everyone. People are talking about this case across the county. Other neighborhoods are starting to question their boards." She looked out at the horizon, her voice soft. Then maybe it was all worth it. After he left, she lingered on the porch, thinking about how far she'd come. She remembered the first time she stood on this same spot, terrified and uncertain, watching the sun dip behind the trees while wondering if she'd made a mistake moving here. Now, that same sun seemed to set differently, warmer, more forgiving. The house that once felt haunted by tension was now her sanctuary. Weeks passed, then months. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm, but every so often Emily would get letters from strangers across the country, homeowners who had seen her story online. Some were trapped in similar battles. Others just wanted to say thank you. They called her brave, but she didn't feel brave. She felt human, and that, she realized, was enough. One night, she decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The air was cool, scented with fresh-cut grass and summer rain. As she walked past the houses, she noticed lights flickering behind windows, families gathered around dinner tables, laughter spilling into the street. It felt like a place reborn. She reached the park where the first community meeting had been held after the HOA's fall. The oak trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches whispering secrets of renewal. Someone had hung lanterns between them, soft amber lights glowing against the dusk. She sat on one of the benches and closed her eyes for a moment. The wind carried faint echoes, not of shouting or arguments, but of peace, of normalcy, and yet, beneath that peace, there was a deeper truth she couldn't ignore. There would always be people like Linda in the world, those who crave control, who build rules to feed their ego, who mistake power for respect, but there would also always be people like her, quiet fighters who refuse to bow, who believe that fairness isn't a privilege, but a right. She opened her eyes, watching the lanterns sway.